Great to have back with us U.S. Congressman Brad Wenstrup from Ohio. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. How you doing, Tom?
I'm doing great. So I know you're headed back to D.C. later today, and it'll be dealing with what you've been chairing this subcommittee, the COVID subcommittee. So let's talk about that first. What is the latest? What are you going to be delving into next?
Well, I think one of the latest things that we discovered through some of the information that we've been requesting, such as emails and other forms of communication, like something called Slack messaging, which I wasn't aware of, we've been finding out quite a bit. But what we do see is that documented in early February of 2020, February 1st, Dr. Fauci had said that the lab leak theory was backed up, basically, because he knew that Wuhan was doing gain-of-function research. And so that's pretty interesting because Dr. Fauci also has been in front of the Senate in the past, and he says we do not now nor ever fund any gain-of-function research in Wuhan, but the NIH had stated to the Oversight Committee in the House of Representatives back then that actually NIH was funding gain-of-function research in China. So that's just the narrative that we've been hearing from them, though, since that time, is that it came from the lab. And all these things that were behind the scenes were saying, well, we know they're doing this research, and let's basically, they just coordinated to say that the lab leak theory was a conspiracy theory, but we're certainly finding out a lot of information otherwise. And I can go through some of that with you if you'd care to.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to hear that, and you know, to the extent of what our involvement, our taxpayer dollars were involved, and then also, and I talked to an Epoch Times reporter on Friday about the Chinese scientist who became a whistleblower. Says, you know, basically they were instructed to find how this could do the most damage. So basically he's saying, that scientist is saying, that this was created to be a bioweapon.
Well, you know, it's interesting because there may be some good intentions with doing gain-of-function research, and I know Dr. Fauci talked about that going back to 2012 and maybe even before that, because he felt if you could create a super virus and have the vaccine for it, then you can probably cure just about anything that comes down the road in the future. But he was pressed on whether he was concerned about if it came and got out of the lab. And he said, well, I think the benefits of this research outweigh the risk, and I think that opportunity for that is pretty low. But we know of lax measures when it comes to biosafety in the lab. We also know that the military in China is deeply involved with this type of research. And we know they have a bioweapons program. And we know that they work with coronaviruses. So you add all these things up, and so what this person may be saying is fundamentally true. And so we have to be on guard for that. I sit on an intelligence committee. Bioweapons has always been a concern of ours in the military and for our public in general. You know, but when you go back to this at the very beginning in 2020, I was doing research to figure out what was going on with the human body and how we could possibly treat it. But in the process, I found an article from 2015 where Ralph Barrick of North Carolina and Dr. Zhengli Shi in China, in Wuhan, were creating chimeras where you take parts of two viruses and make one. And that's called engineering a virus, a gain-of-function type of virus. Well, at the end of January in 2015, or in 2020, Dr. Christian Anderson called Dr. Fauci or communicated with Dr. Fauci and said this thing looks engineered. He immediately put together a team, sent out that article from 2015 that talked about creating a gain-of-function virus, and then got together a conference call with about 11 scientists. And from that, we know that he prompted them to write an article. And what we found through the internal documents is that the goal of that team was to disprove the lab leak theory rather than having a scientific debate. And we've also found that some of the scientists that were involved said things through their communications that he said, given the, I'll just say S show, that would happen if anyone seriously accused the Chinese of even accidental release, my feeling is we should say that given there's no evidence of a specifically engineered virus, we're content to ascribing it to a natural process. Well, I can tell you as a physician, that's not much of a scientific process. And so they put out this article, Proximal Origins, stating that it came from nature. It really didn't have any data or evidence to go with it that was convincing. And later in April of 20, Dr. Collins emails Dr. Fauci and says, this isn't really catching on, the proximal origin story. We've got to push out that this came from nature. And these guys were called the Bethesda Boys by the scientists that put this paper together. And lo and behold, the next day after Collins emails Fauci, he goes on the White House lawn and says that this came from nature based on proximal origins, which he claims he had nothing to do with, but the internal documents would say otherwise. And, we found things by Dr. Morens. He's an advisor to Dr. Fauci. He wrote emails that pushed the zoonotic origin theory, and he says Dr. Fauci didn't want his fingerprints on any of this. These are his words, fingerprints. This guy also went a step further and said, contact me on my Gmail because the Freedom of Information Act has people wanting to see all my emails. And I'll delete anything I don't want the New York Times to see. These are things they were saying. How are we going to have trust in our public health officials when we see things like this?
But we're supposed to trust the science, and Fauci says he is science.
Yeah, and well, it doesn't just work that way anymore. You may be able to, in the past, come out, and his reputation was stellar. I will tell you that the Republicans in the House, the Doctors Caucus, during COVID, we did Zoom calls with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins on Operation Warp Speed and how we were doing with creating a possible vaccine for all this. There was a lot of trust between these well-known scientists, but now we're seeing political motives seem to come into place. And I guess when your funding may be responsible for the production of something that killed people all around the globe, you might want to say it came from somewhere else.
As you dig into this, the origins a little bit deeper, and you find what it looks like you're going to find and solid evidence of that, what happens? I mean, where does this go after it leaves your subcommittee?
Well, one of the goals of our subcommittee is to make sure that any wrongdoing doesn't happen again, and also to prescribe a path forward for the next pandemic. And so just outside of origins of COVID, but including origins of COVID, we want to look at what we did right, what we did wrong, and how we can do better in the future, and how we might be able to predict a pandemic, try to prepare ourselves and protect ourselves from it, and maybe prevent it. That's the ultimate goal of the subcommittee, but it's what we do maybe as members of Congress economically. We passed a lot of bills to try and keep businesses afloat. Did we do well? Was there a lot of fraud associated with the programs we put forward? So we really want to look at all the effects of the pandemic, the lockdown, school closures, et cetera, and be able to make recommendations for the future and possibly legislate some things and just move forward. But it really comes down to doing an after-action review truthfully and honestly and looking at what actually took place without any spin and be able to craft a message for the next time. Because, look, at the beginning of this thing, no one knew what was going on. And so we can be critical, we can be Monday morning quarterbacks, and to a degree we are. But when you start to see things that seem to be done for nefarious reasons, that's a bigger problem than just not knowing what to do.
So when's the next time your subcommittee's meeting?
We're meeting again in a couple weeks, and the topic will be on the mandates, the effects of the mandates, and we will take a look at that and how we did and how it was received by the public and the problems that it caused, for sure. And did we violate civil rights?
Well, what's your initial thought on that question?
Well, I was never for the mandate. if you look at the vaccines early on, the emergency use authorization I thought was good, especially for people that were known to be the most vulnerable, especially vulnerable to die. I don't like medical mandates of any type because I think there should be guidelines. I shouldn't say of any type. There should be guidelines, but you consult with your physician as to, why you might need it or why you might not, or what the risks are. And we avoided that. We've taken the doctor out of the equation in this particular case. And I think it's extremely dangerous for a politician to tell people things like, if you don't get this, you're going to die, and that you must get it or you're going to lose your job. Now, that doesn't build confidence. Americans don't do well with that. Americans want to be educated, not indoctrinated. And so I think that we have to be very careful about any of that in the future. We initially give guidelines, and we explain why we have those guidelines in place and back them up with data.
We're talking with U.S. Congressman Brad Wenstrup, Republican from Ohio's 2nd Congressional District. The National Defense Authorization Act passed. You voted for it. Democrats and the Biden administration are criticizing it because of some provisions that deal with what they say are social things. But you wouldn't have to be dealing with those social things if they weren't already a part of our military. The wokeness of our military is not giving us strength.
No, it is not, and I can tell you that as a soldier. And I served 25 years in the Army Reserve. I was active duty 05-06 as a surgeon, a combat surgeon in Iraq. And I know what it's like to build cohesiveness within your unit. And those things do not do that. They divide us. I mean, I can tell you, for example, what we eliminated is a lot of the DEI type things and the critical race theory. And those should not be taught. I will tell you that under my own command, for example, I had first-generation Korean, Filipino, Puerto Rican, 2 from Nigeria. The rest were Hispanic and African Americans. I was the only Caucasian. We never thought about it. We considered ourselves to be all Americans. We were all human beings, and we were treated equally. We had our rank. I get that. But at the same time, we were all on the same page as Americans, and that is what you want for your military, not things that divide us. And I don't understand why we suddenly think there's a problem when I can tell you firsthand there was no problem. Let us just drive on as Americans and fellow human beings.
Now, the NDAA does provide an increase in basic pay. And it fully funds the National Guard's operation and supports border deployment, which I think is very important.
Yeah, I mean, look, what we're trying to do is address the situations that we have in this world. And a divisive military that is being divided and leads to a decrease in recruitment and retention is a big problem. And so we're plussing up what we're doing for recruitment and retention and getting rid of some of the things that have been driving recruitment and retention down. We're also trying to make sure that our supply chain is safe, that there's no Communist Chinese Party involvement with any construction projects or our fuel supply chain. We're working, I can tell you on another front, that for all of America, but not just within our military, is our pharmaceutical supply chain. China controls that across the world, and the military has been very good at identifying what our risks are. Now we have to do things to make sure we have a domestic supply chain, but that goes across the board, especially for our military. And we did some things where we closed loopholes where the Department of Defense can't fund like Confucius Institutes or contract with consulting firms that do business with the Chinese Communist Party. So a lot in there to try and correct some of the problems that lead us to grave concern. And I'm glad to see the plus up of the National Guard, allowing them to work with local law enforcement agencies. And that part of that is to disrupt and degrade the illicit drug production and trafficking and human trafficking that we have in the United States.
So this bill, it does pass with abortion, the LGBTQ measures, and that. I just don't understand why that's got to be, the Democrats think that has to be in there when that really doesn't have anything to do with our national security.
Yeah, it really doesn't. And so what we took out was the military was starting to say, we will pay to drive you to a state where you can get an abortion if the state you're in doesn't allow it at that time of your pregnancy, et cetera. So you just get out of that. We don't need to be doing that. We need to be a military that increases our readiness, that increases our lethality, and as a result can serve as a greater deterrent for war. That's really what we want our military to be, is so strong that no one wants to mess with us. And then if the time comes that they try to, that it's very swift and it doesn't take long to put down any type of attack against the United States of America.
I don't know if you've seen the movie that's out based upon Tim Ballard, former CIA and Homeland Security guy that is rescuing children. Sound of Freedom. I saw it over the weekend. Incredible movie. Really made me angry, though, what is going on around the world and even in our own country involving sex trafficking of minors. And that really starts at the border, but it's bigger than that. And I hope that this movie will wake up everybody, including those in Congress.
Yeah, it's not only that. You're right about the border, but it's through the internet. There are all types of nefarious ways that people are getting into our society, and really they're a cancer on our society in so many ways. And it's frightening. And I have not seen that movie, but it sounds like I should. We've got to continue these fights, and we've got to make sure we're emphatic about it. So I don't understand why we have an administration that has touted an open border. I don't understand why we have an American political party, the Democrat Party, that is for open borders. I don't know what they hope to gain, but it's very damaging to a civil society. Look, I understand why people want to come to the United States of America, but let's not turn our country into the type of country that they are trying to leave. And that's what makes no sense to me. There is a reason people want to come to our country, and I get that. People have done that since the beginning of time in America. You want to come to the United States because it is a different place. It is an exceptional place. It is a place of law and order. But we now have a political party that just want to open our borders and turn our country into what they are trying to leave.
And I want to get a final thought here from you, Congressman Wenstrup, on Ukraine and what's happening there. We're now sending, I guess, cluster bombs to Ukraine, which Jen Psaki, the former White House press secretary, described as war crimes using those.
Yeah, they're pretty dangerous, and from the standpoint that they often take out innocents, and that's one of the grave concerns about that. And I certainly get that. I understand that they may have already arrived, or we have sent them. This is not coming through Congress or a sense of Congress, which is a concern as always. What I want to know with anything that we're doing as far as aid to Ukraine is how we are spending our dollars and why we are sending dollars for certain things or certain types of equipment, in this case, cluster bombs. That is a concern. At the same time, I do have concerns about saying what we'll never do. You never want to tell your enemy what you'll never do. And so I think in this case, we should just quietly not use those and use something else to help them win and liberate themselves against Russia. But certainly controversial for sure.
U.S. Congressman Brad Wenstrup, Republican from Ohio's 2nd Congressional District, and he is the chair of the subcommittee on COVID origin. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a safe trip back to D.C.
You bet. It's always a pleasure to be with you, Tom. You have a great day.
All right, you too, sir. Back in a moment. You're listening to the Tom Roten Morning Show. It's Tom Roten here for